Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, darker corner of medieval life. A place where the air smelled faintly of candle wax, stale bread, and damp stone walls. We're going to be spending some time in monasteries. The supposed sanctuaries of prayer and discipline. Now, monasteries might sound peaceful, until you remember that they were full of actual people. And people, as we know, are very rarely peaceful. Even when they've shaved their heads and promised obedience. Especially then, in fact. Tonight's question is a simple one. What happened to monks who broke their vows? Because they did. Frequently. And the answer is, not always what you'd expect. Sometimes it was harsh. Sometimes it was almost laughably mild. And sometimes it was swept under the rug with a sort of let's just not talk about this energy. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to the Middle Ages, where a monk's greatest enemy wasn't always the devil. It was usually himself. A monk, in theory, was supposed to live a life of prayer, work, and silence. The Benedictine rule, written way back in the 6th century, laid down the basics: poverty, chastity, and obedience. 3 nice, simple promises. Almost charmingly straightforward. But, of course, these were vows made by human beings. And if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that human beings are not especially good at being poor, celibate, or obedient. Put all 3 together, and you have a recipe for trouble. Let's start with chastity. The most fragile vow of them all. Medieval clerics were technically bound to it, but enforcement was flexible, to put it kindly. Bishops openly had mistresses. Popes had children. So it should come as no surprise that monks often strayed. There are plenty of records of monks caught sneaking out at night to visit local women. Or inviting them in, which was even less subtle. Some monasteries developed reputations as thinly disguised brothels. Which is not exactly what Saint Benedict had in mind. Punishments varied. A monk caught in bed with someone might be stripped naked, flogged in front of the community, and then made to eat his meals on the floor like a dog. Humiliating, yes. But not permanent. If the offense was repeated, or if the abbot was in a particularly grim mood, the monk might be locked in a cell on bread and water for weeks. There are accounts of monks chained to the wall, left to reflect on their sins in cold darkness. A sort of medieval timeout, but with iron shackles and no hope of early release. And yet, despite these penalties, the problem kept happening. Which suggests that bread, water, and chains weren't quite the deterrent the abbots hoped. Then there was poverty. Monks weren't supposed to own anything. Not a coin, not a knife, not even a pen. Everything belonged to the community. In practice, however, some monks became very attached to little luxuries. There are surviving complaints about monks hoarding soft blankets, or sneaking extra candles so they could stay up late reading, or, more often, just gossiping. Some squirreled away coins and hollowed out books. Others kept pets, despite repeated bans. A dog or cat might be hidden in the dormitory, fed scraps under the table, and doted on like a small furry contraband. If discovered, the punishment for secret possessions was usually public shaming. A monk might be made to hand over his stash in front of everyone. Imagine the abbot solemnly pulling a bright red pillow out of someone's trunk, while the rest of the community watched in judgment. Medieval monastic justice at its finest. And then there was obedience. This was the real cornerstone. The abbot was the unquestioned authority. You were supposed to obey without hesitation, like a soldier. And yet, monks disobeyed constantly. Sometimes it was small. A monk refusing to sing a psalm properly. Or muttering under his breath about the length of a sermon. Other times, it escalated into full-on mutiny. In the 12th century, there's a record of an entire group of monks barricading themselves in the refectory and refusing to come out until their abbot resigned. Which is a bold move when your entire vow is literally obedience. Punishments for disobedience could be brutal. Floggings were standard. Exile from the monastery was common. And in rare cases, a monk could be formally excommunicated, cut off from the church entirely. Which, in medieval terms, was spiritual death. But the truth is, punishments weren't always consistent. A powerful monk, maybe from a noble family, could get away with a great deal. Connections mattered. Wealth mattered. Some abbots looked the other way if the offender was useful or influential. There are even records of abbots themselves breaking vows with abandon. One chronicler noted an abbot who loved hunting more than prayer, and dice more than fasting. Another described an abbot who built himself a private suite with feather beds, while his monks slept on straw. So much for poverty. Naturally, when the leader behaved like this, the monks beneath him felt no particular obligation to toe the line. Why suffer on bread and water when your abbot is enjoying roast goose? Sometimes, monks who broke their vows weren't punished at all, because they simply walked away. Running away from the monastery was surprisingly common. The cloistered life could be suffocating, especially for young men who had been placed there by their families with little say in the matter. A runaway monk, if caught, might be dragged back in chains. He could be whipped, locked up, or forced to lie face down at the doorway while the rest of the community stepped over him in silent rebuke. But many weren't caught. They slipped back into the world, joined mercenary bands, or even married. In theory, this was a scandal. In practice, the church often shrugged and moved on. There were always more novices to fill the gaps. Now, we shouldn't imagine every monastery as a den of vice and rebellion. Many monks lived sincere, disciplined lives. They copied manuscripts, tended gardens, cared for the sick, and genuinely tried to follow their vows. But the fact remains, wherever rules exist, so do rule breakers. And medieval monks were no exception. Their humanity slipped through the cracks. In their secret pets, their whispered complaints, their late-night escapades, we catch glimpses of people who, despite the tonsure and the robes, weren't so different from anyone else. Let's drift, then, from cloisters and candlelight to our next royal fiasco. So, we've left behind the monks with their broken vows and their contraband cats. Tonight, let's wander into another corner of medieval and early modern life. One that people usually avoided, unless absolutely necessary. The life of the executioner. Because here's the strange thing, executioners were essential. Everyone wanted them around when justice had to be carried out. But once the axe was down and the sentence fulfilled, no one wanted to sit next to them at dinner. So, how did these people actually live? Let's settle in and find out. Executioners had one of the strangest social positions in history. They were both needed and despised. Both feared and ridiculed. People wanted justice, but they didn't want to shake the hand of the man who delivered it. In many towns, the role of executioner wasn't even voluntary. Someone had to do it, and volunteers were scarce. So the job was often forced onto criminals. A thief might be spared hanging if he agreed to become the hangman himself. Which meant that the man carrying out the law was frequently a man who had just broken it. The irony was not lost on anyone. Now, being an executioner wasn't just about swinging an axe. It was a full-time portfolio of unpleasant tasks. They did the hangings, yes. The beheadings, certainly. But also brandings, mutilations, and floggings. If someone's ear needed to be nailed to a post, or their hand cut off, the executioner was your man. And it didn't stop there. Executioners were also in charge of dealing with corpses. Executed bodies had to be displayed, quartered, or boiled in tar to discourage rebellion. Someone had to handle the messy logistics. And naturally, that someone was the man already covered in blood. It gets worse. Executioners often doubled as knackers, disposing of dead animals, or as cleaners of sewage pits. Because if you were already unclean in one sense, people figured you might as well be unclean in every sense. So, yes. The job description was broad. Axe work in the morning, boiling heads in tar by afternoon, collecting stray dog carcasses by evening. Given all this, you'd expect executioners to live in total misery. And in some ways, they did. They were social outcasts. In many towns, they had to live outside the walls, in a little hut or cottage by themselves. Some were forbidden to enter churches. Others weren't allowed to marry into respectable families. But here's the twist, executioners often made very good money. The job was filthy, but it paid. Towns and cities paid executioners regular salaries, sometimes quite generous ones. On top of that, there were perks. For example, the executioner had the right to claim the clothes of the condemned. And people were executed wearing decent garments, since being hanged in rags wasn't considered proper. Those clothes could then be sold for profit. In some places, executioners also collected a fee from anyone they tortured. Yes, you had to pay the man who stretched you on the rack. A kind of medieval service charge, which makes modern customer service fees look positively humane. Executioners also had a strange sort of power. Their very touch was considered polluting, but also magical. People believed executioners had special knowledge of herbs and healing. Which makes a sort of twisted sense. If you know how to kill, perhaps you also know how to cure. Some executioners doubled as bone setters or healers. They sold charms and potions. People would sneak to them in secret, seeking cures for illnesses. Of course, they'd never admit it in public. Respectable folk couldn't be seen asking the hangman to fix a broken arm. But in the shadows, business was brisk. As for their personal lives, well, let's just say they weren't easy. Executioners' children inherited the stigma. Many became executioners themselves, because no one else would marry them, and no other trade would accept them. Whole dynasties of hangmen sprang up, passing the axe from father to son like an unfortunate family heirloom. One famous example is the Sanson family of France, who served as executioners in Paris for over a century. They handled everything from petty thieves to the beheading of Louis XVI during the French Revolution. Imagine introducing yourself at a party as Sanson, 7th-generation beheader of kings. Conversation stopper, guaranteed. Now, about the actual work. It might surprise you, but executioners were judged on skill. A sloppy job was considered deeply shameful. If you bungled a beheading and had to swing multiple times, people remembered. Some poor executioners became infamous for missing the neck entirely, hacking into shoulders, or reducing a royal prisoner to something resembling a butcher's stall. On the other hand, a clean, quick strike was admired. Crowds would nod approvingly. Ah yes, one blow. Very professional. It was a grim kind of craftsmanship. But the job also came with strange privileges. Executioners were untouchable, in a literal sense. If they brushed past you in the street, you might recoil, but you couldn't strike them back. Laying hands on an executioner could bring fines or curses. They were both despised and protected. There are records of executioners being invited, secretly, into noble households to act as private enforcers. Because if you wanted someone discreetly removed, who better than the man who already had all the tools? Executioners, then, lived double lives. Ostracized in public, useful in private. Poor in reputation, rich in coin. Feared and mocked, yet indispensable. Of course, some leaned into the role. If you're going to be hated, you might as well enjoy the perks. Executioners sometimes paraded around in fine clothes taken from the condemned. Others built small empires, selling charms, running side businesses, even lending money. And naturally, this didn't improve their reputation. People whispered that executioners were greedy, cruel, or corrupt. Which was probably true of some. But others were simply trapped in the role. Once you were marked as a hangman, there was no going back. No respectable guild would have you. No merchant wanted your custom. The axe was for life. What strikes me, drifting through all these accounts, is how contradictory it all was. Executioners were shunned, but relied upon. They were hated, but paid well. They were thought of as filthy, yet sought out as healers. Their families were avoided, yet kept in business for generations. It's the paradox of every society, really. Someone has to do the unpleasant work. And the people who benefit from it rarely want to acknowledge the hands that make it happen. So, next time you hear about a medieval executioner, don't just picture the hood and the axe. Picture a man trudging home with a sack of second-hand tunics, a side hustle and herbal remedies, and a family waiting in a lonely cottage just outside the town walls. And with that, let's drift quietly toward our next set of unfortunate figures. So far, we've looked at monks who couldn't behave, and executioners who no one wanted to sit beside. Now, let's turn to something subtler. The long, slow art of poisoning. Because while history has plenty of dramatic assassinations, with swords and arrows and public spectacle, there's something uniquely human about the preference for poison. It's quiet. It's sneaky. It leaves your enemy gasping into their soup while you smile politely across the table. But the question tonight isn't really about the poisoners. It's about the poisoned. Who, in history, found themselves most often on the receiving end? And the answer, as usual, is royals. Nobles. The very people who could afford cooks, testers, and silver goblets, yet somehow managed to ingest more lethal substances than the average rat catcher. Let's begin with the Borgias. You probably know the name. They were the Italian Renaissance family with a reputation for intrigue, corruption, and the occasional scandal involving cardinals, mistresses, and unfortunate banquet guests. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, is often accused of poisoning rivals. His son, Cesare Borgia, is rumored to have done the same. But the irony is that the Borgias themselves may have died by their own poison. One account suggests that Alexander and Cesare prepare a flask of poisoned wine for a cardinal they disliked. Unfortunately, the bottle was mixed up at dinner, and they ended up drinking their own creation. Because of course they did. Alexander died, and Cesare staggered away, poisoned but somehow still clinging to life. It's the Renaissance equivalent of accidentally eating your own labeled leftovers in the fridge. Only with more convulsions. But perhaps no one was poisoned quite so reliably as English royalty. Let's drift over to the Tudors. They had enemies, plots, and plenty of paranoia. Henry VIII, that walking collection of medical problems, was terrified of being poisoned. He employed food tasters, locked down his kitchens, and forbade certain cooks from leaving the palace. And yet, his daughter, Elizabeth I, nearly poisoned herself through fashion. You see, Elizabeth was very fond of makeup. Specifically, a white foundation made from lead. Lead that soaked into her skin daily, slowly, persistently. It gave her the desired pale look, while also gifting her headaches, stomach pains, and, eventually, decaying teeth. Courtiers politely called her smile majestic. What they meant was rotting. Elizabeth wasn't alone. Noble women across Europe painted their faces with the same toxic paste. Many also used eye drops made from belladonna, which dilated the pupils and gave a dreamy look. Belladonna is also known as deadly nightshade. Because of course it is. And while it did make the eyes larger and more mysterious, it also caused blurred vision, hallucinations, and, in generous doses, death. So yes, many noble women of the period spent their lives slowly poisoning themselves in the pursuit of beauty. Which is one of history's recurring themes. If the fashion looks dangerous, it probably is. Now, let's drift further east, to the Byzantine Empire. If you thought Western Europe was fond of a bit of poison, Constantinople perfected it. Poison was practically a political hobby. Emperors, generals, bishops, anyone could find themselves suddenly unwell after a suspicious dinner. One favorite Byzantine poison was derived from hemlock mixed with aconite. Another was ground glass, slipped discreetly into wine. Which didn't so much poison as shred your insides. Subtle in theory, less subtle in execution. The Empress Irene, for example, was rumored to have eliminated several rivals this way. She had a talent for combining prayer with a well-timed chalice of something fatal. You could argue it was multitasking. France also gave us some spectacularly poisoned figures. Louis XIV's court was rocked by the affair of the poisons in the 1670s. This was less a single case and more a full-blown poisoning epidemic. Aristocrats, desperate for inheritances or lovers, bought potions from shadowy fortune-tellers. Husbands died. Wives wasted away. Mistresses expired at inconvenient moments. The scandal eventually reached Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress. She was accused of dabbling in poison and even black magic. Nothing was proven, but the suspicion lingered. Which meant that the Sun King, despite his golden image, spent many years eating dinner with a faint sense of dread. But sometimes, poison wasn't intentional. Sometimes, people poisoned themselves simply by living in luxurious ignorance. Take Napoleon. When he died on St. Helena, many whispered he had been poisoned by the British. In reality, his wallpaper was more to blame. The green dye used in his rooms was laced with arsenic. Arsenic that, in a damp climate, released toxic fumes. So Napoleon may have slowly inhaled his way to death while staring at walls. Which feels, frankly, like the saddest way for an emperor to go. And then there's the Habsburgs. A dynasty already famous for marrying their cousins until their family tree looked like a tightly knotted shoelace. Poison wasn't their main issue, but lead pipes in their palaces and mercury-based medicines didn't help. Doctors prescribed mercury for syphilis, among other things. The treatment was as bad as the disease. Imagine being both inbred and slowly pickled in mercury. A true family tradition. What stands out, drifting through all these tales, is how often the poison were complicit in their own downfall. They wore the makeup. They swallowed the tonics. They trusted the court physician, who thought powdered emeralds made a fine digestive. Half the time, no villain was required. Just fashion, bad science, and a willingness to swallow whatever glittered. So, when we ask who are the most poisoned people in history, the answer isn't one unlucky king or empress. It's an entire social class. The wealthy, the noble, the beautiful. They spent centuries poisoning themselves slowly, while worrying about being poisoned quickly. And in a way, that seems the perfect irony. After all, if you insist on living in palaces lined with arsenic wallpaper, drinking wine laced with lead goblets, and powdering your face with toxic paste, your enemies hardly need to bother. You've already done their work for them. So let's leave our royals coughing delicately into their goblets and drift towards something gentler. Because not every story of the past needs to involve shackles, axes, or convulsions at dinner. Sometimes, we can ask a softer question. Like, what did children in the ancient world actually do for fun? But that's for our next stretch of night. We've lingered with monks in their chains, hung back with executioners on the edge of town, and sipped suspicious wine with poison royalty. It feels only fair now to drift into something a little softer. Tonight, let's ask a surprisingly simple question. What did children in the ancient world actually do for fun? Because we tend to picture the past as serious. A land of kings, wars, plagues, and important speeches carved into stone. But behind all of that, there were children. And children, being children, were not interested in diplomacy. They were interested in toys, games, and occasionally setting something on fire when no one was looking. So let's wander through Egypt, Greece, Rome, and a few other corners of antiquity, and see what kept the smallest members of society busy. Let's start in ancient Egypt. Now, Egyptian art gives us plenty of dignified poses of pharaohs smiting enemies, gods with animal heads, and solemn scribes. But if you look closer, there are also little glimpses of daily life. Children running, playing, and holding toys that have somehow survived the centuries. Egyptian children had dolls, carved from wood or made from cloth stuffed with reeds. Some had movable limbs. A few even had wigs, which suggests that vanity started early. One particularly charming find is a doll with a string attached, so her arms flapped when pulled. Which makes her, essentially, the ancestor of every toy designed to annoy parents with motion and noise. They also had balls made from papyrus and leather, hoops to roll along the ground, and little carved animals on wheels. The kind of toys you'd recognize instantly, even after 3,000 years. And of course, there were games without toys. Wrestling, chasing, mock battles. Children in villages near the Nile probably invented water games the moment someone pushed the first child into the river. Hopefully not too close to the crocodiles. Now let's drift west to ancient Greece. Greek children, unsurprisingly, enjoyed games that trained them for adulthood. Boys practiced running, wrestling, and throwing things. Which sounds very much like every PE class in history. Girls, in wealthier households, were expected to be quieter, but they still had dolls, rattles, and knucklebones. Knucklebones were popular everywhere. They were, quite literally, the ankle bones of sheep or goats, tossed and caught in games that were part jacks, part dice. Children played for fun. Adults played for gambling. Some people even claimed to divine the future from the way the bones landed. So, yes, a children's game was also an oracular practice, which is very Greek. Another popular pastime was spinning hoops with sticks. Children chased them down the streets, sometimes decorating the hoops with bells. Which means ancient parents also suffered through the endless jingling of toys, just like modern ones. Some things never change. And then we come to Rome. Roman children had toys that would look surprisingly familiar. Tiny wooden swords, toy chariots, rattles, dolls made of ivory or clay. Some dolls even had little wardrobes with miniature tunics, because apparently fashion was as important in doll culture then as it is now. Wealthier Roman boys had tutors, lessons, and endless writing exercises on wax tablets, which they probably found about as fun as modern homework. So when they escaped, they played ball games. The Romans had a whole assortment of balls, small, large, filled with air or stuffed with hair. The games ranged from simple tossing to more chaotic versions of keep away. Girls, meanwhile, had jump ropes and dolls. On the eve of marriage, a Roman girl was expected to dedicate her childhood toys to the gods, placing them in temples. A symbolic farewell to childhood, with one last trip to the divine lost and found. But Roman children also played war. Toy soldiers, miniature siege engines, wooden swords. Which makes sense in a society where war was a career path as common as accountancy. Now, let's drift further north, into colder lands. Children in Celtic and Germanic tribes probably had fewer ivory dolls, but they weren't lacking in play. Archaeologists have found little carved animals, wooden swords, and whistles made of bone. Simple, practical toys. The kind you could whittle while watching sheep. And of course, there were games of skill. Throwing stones at targets. Racing each other barefoot through muddy fields. Wrestling in the dirt. If you picture a medieval village full of children shrieking as they chase one another with sticks, you're not far off from their Iron Age predecessors. Now, the question of mischief. Because wherever there are children, there is trouble. Ancient writers occasionally mention it. Roman authors grumbled about children playing noisily in the streets, or pelting passers-by with stones. Egyptian texts describe children who refused to sit still during lessons. In Greece, philosophers complained that youth spent too much time playing dice. Which is, admittedly, exactly what the philosophers themselves did in old age. So we can be fairly sure that children in antiquity laughed too loudly, broke their toys, and occasionally made their parents regret not choosing a life of celibacy. Again, some things never change. Of course, fun was not always harmless. There are grim hints, too. Roman children amused themselves at gladiatorial games, cheering as men and animals fought. Wealthy children sometimes practiced with real weapons on real slaves. The line between play and cruelty blurred uncomfortably. For every harmless hoop or doll, there was also a pastime that foreshadowed a violent adulthood. And yet, alongside that darkness, there are the softer moments. A clay rattle shaped like a pig. A doll buried lovingly with a little girl in her tomb. A ball found under the ruins of a collapsed Roman house, abandoned mid-game. These fragments remind us that children were children. Curious. Playful. Eager to make a game out of anything within reach. So, what did ancient children do all day? They wrestled, ran, played dice, and spun hoops. They dressed dolls and rolled toy chariots. They teased each other, annoyed their parents, and occasionally set things on fire. In short, they did what children everywhere have always done. They played. And while kings schemed, armies marched, and empires rose and fell, a ball was still being tossed in the street, and a doll's hair was still being braided in a quiet courtyard. The great dramas of history happened alongside the small dramas of playtime. Let's drift, then, from the laughter of children back toward the dim candlelight of palaces. Because our next figures are not playful at all. They are pale, anxious, and decidedly unhealthy. Next, we'll explore the most inbred monarchs of European history. We've listened to monks fumbling their vows, executioners juggling axes in second-hand tunics, poison seeping into royal goblets, and children chasing hoops down Roman streets. Now it's time to return to the people history loves most, and treated worst, monarchs. Specifically, those who were very, very inbred. Because if you've ever wondered what happens when dynasties insist on marrying cousins, uncles, nieces, and occasionally the nearest available Habsburg, well, the answer is nothing good. Nothing good at all. So tonight, let's drift through the pale, jaw-heavy halls of Europe's most unfortunate royals. We begin, inevitably, with the Habsburgs. No family embraced inbreeding with quite the same determination. For centuries, they controlled vast stretches of Europe, and they believed the best way to keep it all together was to marry each other. Again. And again. And again. The result? Generations of monarchs with what we now call the Habsburg jaw. A jaw so prominent it looked like a small architectural feature. The kind of jaw that made eating, speaking, and closing the mouth fully into daily challenges. The most famous example was Charles II of Spain. Known to his subjects, rather optimistically, as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Charles was the product of so much inbreeding that his family tree looked more like a tightly wound circle. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also related. By the time he was born, he had fewer unique ancestors than most people's houseplants. The consequences were predictable. Charles was sickly, unable to walk until he was 4, unable to speak clearly until he was 8, and unable to chew food without considerable difficulty. He suffered from seizures, intestinal troubles, and infertility. Which meant that after all the effort to preserve the dynasty, Charles left no heirs. The line ended with him. In other words, centuries of cousin marriage culminated in a man who could barely eat dinner and certainly couldn't produce children. Nature has a sense of humor. But the Habsburgs didn't corner the market on inbreeding. Let's drift over to Egypt, where the Ptolemies, descendants of Alexander the Great's general, ruled. They too preferred to keep things in the family. Brother married sister. Sometimes uncle married niece. The logic was simple: if you were descended from gods, why dilute the bloodline with ordinary humans? The result was Cleopatra VII, the famous one. She is often remembered for her wit, her charm, and her liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Less often mentioned is that she was the product of generations of sibling marriage. Which may explain why several of her relatives suffered from deformities, seizures, and early deaths. Cleopatra herself seems to have been lucky, sharp, charismatic, apparently healthy. But her siblings? Not so fortunate. One brother, Ptolemy XIII, drowned in the Nile while trying to escape battle. Another, Ptolemy XIV, was probably poisoned by Cleopatra herself. A family full of dynastic knots and very little genetic breathing room. And then there were the Stuarts. England's royal family had its share of genetic misfortune, though theirs was less about deliberate inbreeding and more about stubborn repetition. King James II of England, for example, had so many intermarriages among his ancestors that gout became practically a family tradition. His descendants suffered fragile health, short lifespans, and a general tendency toward melancholy. Not exactly the stuff of inspiring leadership. But perhaps the most famous product of inbreeding outside the Habsburg orbit was the unfortunate line of epileptic rulers in various European courts. Whole dynasties seemed to pass seizures down like family jewels. French King Charles IX, for example, suffered violent fits, paranoia, and possibly blood poisoning from stress and bad medicine. His ancestors had married cousins until mental stability was more myth than reality. What's striking in all these cases is how completely obvious the problems were, and how little it changed behavior. Everyone could see that Charles II of Spain could barely function. Everyone knew that sibling marriage in Egypt produced fragile heirs. And yet, the pattern continued. Because dynasties feared one thing more than genetic disaster: losing power to outsiders. Better a child who couldn't chew than a cousin who wasn't royal enough. And so the palace nurseries filled with pale, weak infants. Some survived, most didn't. Mortality was high, fertility low, and Europe's thrones creaked under the weight of inherited frailty. Now, it would be unfair to suggest that all royals were disasters. Some were perfectly healthy. Some even lived long lives. But the pattern is hard to miss. When your main marriage strategy is which cousin is closest, you don't need an oracle to predict the outcome. Inbreeding left its mark not just on jaws and stomachs, but on politics. When Charles II of Spain died childless, the War of the Spanish Succession erupted. A massive European conflict triggered, essentially, by one man's inability to reproduce. Thousands dead, millions spent, all because the Habsburg family tree was a little too circular. So, who were the most inbred monarchs in European history? The Habsburgs, certainly. The Ptolemies, without doubt. Many others, quietly and less spectacularly. They were the men and women who proved, again and again, that dynastic pride could override common sense. And as we drift past their portraits, those pale faces, those heavy jaws, those weary eyes, we can't help but notice the irony. They ruled vast empires, commanded armies, and claimed divine descent. And yet, they couldn't outrun the simplest truth of biology: marry your cousins too many times, and eventually the family line folds in on itself. So let's leave them there, in their palaces, carefully painted by court artists who smoothed over the worst deformities. Smiling faintly, though often unable to close their mouths. Surrounded by velvet, jewels, and dynastic despair. Next, we'll wander towards something a little more ridiculous. Because monarchs weren't just sickly and inbred. They were also petty, dramatic, and sometimes embarrassingly human. In our next stretch of night, let's drift into the pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens. Hey everyone, let's sink a little deeper into the covers, let the outside world fade, and wander back into the velvet-draped rooms of royal courts. Where the ceilings were gilded, the candles dripped endlessly, and the people in charge were often, well, embarrassingly small-minded. Because if there's one truth history whispers again and again, it's this: kings and queens were rarely noble in spirit. In fact, many of them were petty. Very petty. The kind of people who started wars over insults, sulked for decades over slights, and made their courtiers' lives miserable over who got to sit in which chair. Tonight we'll drift through some of their finest, most dysfunctional moments. Let's begin with Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. He ruled for 72 years, which sounds impressive. And to be fair, he did oversee a glittering court and some rather fancy buildings, Versailles included. But he also had a pettiness streak that would make a middle school drama club blush. At Versailles, the hierarchy of who could approach him, who could hand him his gloves, and who could watch him get dressed in the morning was strictly choreographed. Nobles fought bitterly for the honor of passing him a sleeve. Imagine entire dynasties humbled because they weren't chosen to hand the king his socks. Louis engineered this system deliberately. By keeping his nobles busy competing for ridiculous privileges, he made sure they didn't have time to challenge him politically. Clever, yes. But also, exquisitely petty. And when it came to personal slights, Louis was unforgiving. One wrong word, one failed bow, and a courtier could find himself banished. Sometimes permanently. Versailles was essentially the world's most beautiful detention hall. Next, let's float over to Henry VIII of England, who practically made pettiness his state policy. We often remember him for his 6 wives, but Henry was equally remarkable for his thin skin. If you contradicted him, you were gone. If you failed to flatter him properly, gone. If you produced a daughter instead of a son, well, ask in Boleyn how that went. Henry once had a loyal minister, Cardinal Wolsey, who had served him faithfully for years. But when Wolsey failed to secure the Pope's approval for Henry's divorce, Henry dropped him instantly. Wolsey died in disgrace, abandoned. Because for Henry, loyalty meant nothing if you couldn't get him exactly what he wanted. And then there was Thomas More, who refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the Church of England. More had been his friend, his companion, a witty man Henry had once admired. But when More wouldn't sign the right papers, Henry sent him to the chopping block. Petty, vindictive, and wrapped in royal velvet. From England, we can drift up into the chilly north, to Christina of Sweden. Christina was brilliant, eccentric, and spectacularly difficult. She loved philosophy, invited scholars to her court, and then routinely insulted them. She refused to marry, scandalized her nobles, and eventually abdicated. But along the way, her pettiness shone like a candle in a drafty hall. One of her favorites was the philosopher René Descartes. She summoned him to Stockholm to tutor her in philosophy, Unfortunately, she preferred early morning lessons. At 5 a.m. in a freezing Swedish winter. Descartes, not being built for Scandinavian dawns, promptly caught pneumonia and died. Christina? She shrugged. Then she spent years quarreling with nearly everyone who tried to advise her. Her court became a revolving door of exasperated nobles. Christina's dysfunction wasn't subtle, it was her daily routine. But if we want a masterclass in pettiness, we have to return to France. Consider Louis XI, sometimes called the universal spider for his habit of weaving endless political plots. He was cunning, yes, but also notoriously vindictive. He loved to humiliate his enemies in inventive ways. One favorite punishment was to force captured nobles to wear humiliating costumes at court. He delighted in reducing once proud aristocrats to trembling figures in ridiculous hats. It was power expressed through mockery. Louis XI even distrusted his own courtiers to such an extent that he surrounded himself with astrologers, executioners, and peasants rather than nobles. He would spend hours in conversation with his hangman, because, naturally, he trusted the man who killed people more than the man who handed him documents. Dysfunction, wrapped in superstition. Now, let's drift down into Spain, where the pettiness was often dynastic. Philip II of Spain, the son of Charles V, was deeply devout, deeply paranoid, and deeply boring to dine with. He once spent 15 years refusing to leave the gloomy halls of the Escorial Palace. And when he did interact with others, it was usually to hold grudges. Philip married 4 times. His first marriage was to Maria of Portugal, who died young. His second was to Mary Tudor of England, a marriage that made him King of England for a while. After Mary died, Philip proposed marriage to her sister, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, wisely, declined. Philip never quite forgave her. Their rivalry spilled into war, culminating in the Spanish Armada, a military disaster. A vast fleet launched partly because Philip couldn't handle rejection. Yes, one of the greatest naval debacles in history may have started as the world's pettiest breakup revenge. Meanwhile, in Russia, Ivan the Terrible made dysfunction his brand. Ivan could be charming, literate, even visionary. And then, the next moment, he would spiral into paranoid rages. His court lived in terror of his moods. He created the Oprichniki, a secret police force dressed in black, carrying dog heads and brooms to symbolize sniffing out treason and sweeping it away. Their main function? To terrify everyone Ivan didn't like that week. His paranoia reached its peak when he struck his own son in a fit of rage, killing him. An ergon, simply because Ivan couldn't control his temper. Few monarchs embodied dysfunction so completely. His reign was a long, drawn-out tantrum. Petty monarchs didn't just ruin their own courts, they often dragged entire nations into their squabbles. Take Richard II of England. He was handsome, poetic, and deeply insecure. Richard insisted on being addressed with elaborate titles, demanded extreme deference, and punished anyone who didn't grovel enough. He surrounded himself with favorites, alienated his nobles, and eventually provoked a rebellion. At one point, he confiscated the estates of Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin. A decision that directly led to his deposition. Richard lost his crown because he couldn't resist grabbing property out of spite. And in classic royal dysfunction fashion, Richard never quite understood what went wrong. Of course, we can't forget the smaller, quieter examples. Queens who feuded over seating arrangements. Dukes who sulked because someone else had a shinier robe. Entire royal households that collapsed over whose dog barked too loudly at dinner. Court etiquette was designed to amplify pettiness, and kings and queens excelled at it. What we learn, drifting through these courts, is that power doesn't make people less small-minded. If anything, it magnifies their worst habits. Louis XIV turned pettiness into architecture. Henry VIII weaponized it into executions. Ivan the Terrible translated it into national terror. And many others just simmered in dysfunction, dragging their nobles, their families, and sometimes entire countries along with them. And the irony, of course, is that these were the people held up as God's chosen rulers. Anointed, sacred, supposedly elevated above ordinary humanity. Yet half the time they behaved like sulky children in costumes too expensive to wash. So let's leave them now, pacing their gilded halls, muttering over slights, and clutching grudges as tightly as their crowns. In the next stretch, we'll wander into something softer but no less tragic. The fragile world of royal childhoods, where princes and princesses grew up lonely, overprotected, and occasionally fed on diets of wine, sugar, and despair. Because nothing says sleep well like the bedtime stories of kings who couldn't sleep at all. Hey everyone, let's sink deeper into the pillows, let your thoughts soften, and drift with me into another strange corner of royal life. Tonight we're wandering not through thrones or battlefields, but nurseries. The quiet, echoing chambers where kings and queens once began as children. Though, of course, childhood for royals wasn't quite the cozy picture books and teddy bears we like to imagine. Royal childhoods were often fragile. Sometimes unbearably lonely. Sometimes disastrously unhealthy. And always, weighed down with expectations that would make most adults crack. So let's drift through the palaces and see what it meant to be a little prince or princess. Let's start with Louis XIII of France. Louis was crowned king at the tender age of 9. Which sounds glamorous, until you realize he spent much of his early life terrified of his own mother, Marie de Medici, and surrounded by scheming courtiers. Instead of toys, he had regents plotting power grabs. Instead of friends, he had servants who bowed too deeply. Louis grew up anxious, stuttering, and emotionally dependent on his advisors. By adulthood, he was incapable of forming relaxed relationships. His childhood had left him brittle, wary, and lonely. All because his cradle was made of gold. Then there's Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary became queen when she was 6 days old. Which is not exactly an age where one can appreciate the perks of monarchy. She spent her early years being passed from nurse to noble, constantly under threat from English armies, and eventually shipped off to France for safety. Her French upbringing was meant to make her refined. Instead, it left her alienated from her own country. When she returned to rule Scotland as a teenager, she spoke French more comfortably than Scots. Imagine being a queen at 16, ruling a people who already resented you, while privately you were still a girl who hadn't really had a childhood at all. Royal childhoods weren't just politically strange, they were medically questionable. Take Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Edward was raised as the golden Protestant heir. His tutors drilled him in theology, languages, and obedience. But his body was frail from the beginning. Sickly, coughing, and undersized, Edward was essentially treated as a porcelain figurine. He died at 15, leaving behind a religious crisis. In other words, the poor boy never had much of a life outside of study and illness. A teenager expected to save England, but never allowed to live like a child. And then there were the food habits. In the medieval and early modern world, royal children were often fed diets that would horrify a modern nutritionist. Wine diluted with water was considered safer than plain water, so toddlers sipped alcohol daily. Sugar, being expensive, was piled onto the tables of little princes and princesses, who promptly developed rotting teeth before they could walk properly. One example, Louis XIV's court loved sweets so much that aristocratic children were regularly given candied fruit, honey-drenched nuts, and sugared wine. By adulthood, many royals had lost most of their teeth. Not exactly a recipe for robust childhoods. Then there's the matter of loneliness. Royal children were often raised apart from their parents. Kings and queens saw their offspring rarely, sometimes only during formal audiences. The day-to-day care was left to wet nurses, governesses, and tutors. The result was generations of rulers who had no real bond with their parents, and often struggled to form bonds later in life. Consider Frederick the Great of Prussia. As a child, he adored music and poetry. His father, Frederick William I, hated these interests and believed they were unmanly. The king beat him, humiliated him, and at one point even forced him to watch the execution of his best friend, punishment for trying to run away. Frederick's childhood left scars that never healed. He grew into a brilliant ruler, yes, but also a cold, brittle man who carried his loneliness everywhere. Of course, sometimes the dysfunction was more absurd than tragic. Peter the Great of Russia, for instance, grew up in a court riddled with factional violence. As a boy, he He witnessed armed uprisings and bloody executions. He developed a fascination with weapons and military drills. By 12, he was staging mock battles with hundreds of boys in miniature regiments. What looked like play was really trauma, replayed endlessly. Peter grew up obsessed with armies, discipline, and control, habits that would shape his reign. His childhood games were essentially state policy rehearsals. And then there was Charles VI of France, known later as Charles the Mad. Charles became king at 11. His early years were filled with pressure from uncles who drained the treasury and maneuvered for influence. As he grew, the weight of responsibility, combined with the stress of court intrigues, slowly broke him. By his 20s, Charles suffered bouts of psychosis. He believed he was made of glass, terrified that he might shatter if touched. His fragile mental state had roots in a fragile, lonely childhood that offered no stability. It's easy to imagine royal children with golden toys and lavish banquets. The reality was often cold stone chambers, strict tutors, and the endless shadow of politics. Play was limited. Friends were scarce. Expectations were suffocating. A modern child might be scolded for not finishing homework. A royal child could be scolded for endangering the fate of the kingdom. Not exactly the kind of pressure you want before your voice has even broken. Perhaps the saddest thing about these fragile royal childhoods is how predictable the results were. Lonely children grew into insecure monarchs. Sickly heirs left dynasties unstable. Abused princes became tyrants. Sheltered princesses made disastrous marriages. The dysfunction of the nursery was often written across the history of entire nations. So let's picture them now. Tiny figures in elaborate gowns, sitting stiffly on thrones too large for their bodies. Tutors droning in Latin. Servants bowing instead of hugging. Parents glimpsed like distant stars. They were heirs, not children. Sacred symbols before they could even walk. And in many cases, they never really escaped that burden. Let's drift away from the nurseries now, leaving behind the fragile princes and princesses. Next, we'll return to the strange and darkly comic world of adulthood. A place where royal decisions went horribly wrong, not just because of inbreeding or childhood trauma, but because rulers were, quite simply, human disasters. But that's for another stretch of night. For now, let the royal children rest. At last. Hey everyone, let's pull the covers a little higher, let the hum of the day fall away, and drift back into the gilded halls of Europe. Tonight we're not just looking at royal children or petty tantrums. Tonight we're watching kings and queens make choices, serious, dynastic choices, that turned out to be medical disasters. Because when your family tree looks like a tangled necklace, and you keep insisting that your cousin is also your ideal spouse, the results are rarely good. But monarchs were nothing if not committed to bad ideas. Especially when those bad ideas involved marriage contracts written in Latin. So let's wander through some of history's worst royal genetic decisions. We begin, inevitably, with the Habsburgs of Spain. Their motto might as well have been, "Why marry outside the family when your uncle is available?" The most famous disaster was, of course, Charles II of Spain. His parents were uncle and niece, and their parents had been related as well. By the time Charles came into the world, his family tree was less a tree and more a very tired stick. The decision to keep marrying cousins wasn't accidental. It was deliberate policy. The Spanish Habsburgs feared losing territory to outsiders, so they tightened their marriages until the bloodline resembled watered-down soup. The genetic consequences were brutal. Charles was unable to chew food properly, suffered seizures, and could not produce children. He died childless in 1700, and his passing set off the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that dragged in most of Europe. So one royal marriage strategy didn't just ruin a man's health. It triggered years of bloodshed. In other words, the most expensive war of the early 18th century was basically caused by a family who really didn't want to invite strangers to Christmas dinner. Let's drift east, to Austria, where the Habsburgs had similar habits. Maria Theresa of Austria, the formidable empress, tried her best to manage her enormous brood of 16 children. She arranged marriages for them all, naturally prioritizing dynastic ties. One of her daughters, Marie Antoinette, ended up in France. We know how that ended, badly, with cake, guillotines, and very poor public relations. But within the Austrian line itself, the relentless cousin marriage continued. Generations later, it gave us Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand suffered from hydrocephalus, epilepsy, and a tendency to repeat sentences endlessly. His mental and physical condition was so poor that he was considered unfit to rule. But, being a Habsburg, he did anyway. The Imperial Council quietly made decisions for him while Ferdinand lived a life of confused rituals, mumbling to himself. The genetic bill had come due. If we travel back in time to Egypt, we find an even earlier example, the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, decided that sibling marriage was the purest form of royal union. Gods, after all, married their sisters, why shouldn't kings? One result was Ptolemy VIII, also known as Physcon, which, charmingly, translates to potbelly. He earned his nickname honestly. Ptolemy was grotesquely overweight, cruel, and prone to murdering relatives. He married his sister. He then also married his sister's daughter. The family reunions must have been confusing. Genetics didn't thank the Ptolemies. Over time, the line grew increasingly frail. Children died young, rulers grew eccentric, and Cleopatra VII was left desperately trying to hold together a kingdom already rotting from within. The dynasty collapsed not long after. So much for divine marriage. We should also drift into Britain, where genetic disasters had a slightly different flavor. Take George III. The Mad King has long fascinated historians. For centuries, people assumed his erratic behavior, his mania, his rambling speeches, his tendency to write letters that went on for pages without punctuation, was simple insanity. But modern studies suggest he may have suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder. Where did he get it? Most likely through generations of intermarriage among the Hanoverian and Stuart lines. His illness wasn't just personal, it had political consequences. His fits of madness weakened Britain's monarchy during critical years, including the loss of the American colonies. Which means cousin marriage indirectly helped the United States win independence. A strange sort of genetic butterfly effect. And then there's hemophilia, the so-called royal disease. The condition first appeared in Queen Victoria's descendants. Hemophilia is a blood disorder that prevents clotting, turning even a small cut into a life-threatening injury. Victoria herself was a carrier, probably through a random genetic mutation. But once it entered her line, it spread like spilled ink. Her daughters and granddaughters married across Europe, carrying hemophilia into the royal houses of Germany, Spain, and most famously, Russia. Which brings us to Alexei Romanov, son of Tsar Nicholas II in Alexandria. Alexei inherited hemophilia. His parents lived in constant terror of accidents. A bruise could kill him. A stumble could be fatal. Desperate for a cure, Alexandra turned to the mystic Rasputin. His strange influence over the royal family, based largely on his ability to calm Alexei's symptoms, helped destabilize the Russian monarchy. And soon after, the monarchy itself collapsed in revolution. So one bad gene, carried by a grandmother in England, helped topple the Romanovs. Genetics, it turns out, can be just as revolutionary as politics. If we zoom out, we see the same pattern again and again. Royal families believed they were preserving divine bloodlines. But what they were really preserving were recessive genes. Epilepsy, madness, infertility, hydrocephalus, hemophilia, all became family heirlooms. The very thing they feared most, losing power to outsiders, was exactly what their inbreeding guaranteed. Because weak heirs meant unstable thrones. Childless monarchs meant succession wars. Sickly rulers meant manipulative regents running the show. Europe's endless dynastic conflicts weren't just about politics. They were about biology. What's quietly funny, if you enjoy grim irony, is how little the royals seem to learn. Every generation, the warning signs were there. Children who couldn't walk. Heirs who couldn't speak. Kings who couldn't think. And still, the marriage contracts rolled on. Another cousin, another niece, another fragile baby in another gilded cradle. Dynasty over destiny. Until destiny finally snapped. So, what did all these decisions mean? For the monarchs themselves, it meant short lives, lonely reigns, and in many cases, humiliation. For their subjects, it meant instability. Civil wars, succession crises, and foreign invasions, often triggered by nothing more than a defective jawline or a weak heart. It's strange to think of Europe's map being redrawn not by generals, but by genetics. But in many ways, that's exactly what happened. So let's leave them now, the kings and queens who trusted their cousins a little too much. We'll let them drift back into their portraits. Pale faces, tired eyes, and dynastic ambition etched in oil paint. And in the next part of our wandering, we'll step away from bloodlines for a moment. Instead, we'll look at the quiet, daily routines of monarchs. What they ate, how they dressed, and the bizarre rituals that made up an ordinary royal day. Because sometimes history isn't in wars or bloodlines. It's in the way a king spent his morning trying, and failing, to get out of bed gracefully. Picture it, a gilded bedchamber, walls lined with velvet, the faint smell of beeswax candles and incense. Outside, servants whisper, waiting for the precise moment when a king or queen stirs. Because in royal courts, even waking up was political. We begin in France, with Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis didn't simply wake up. He was woken. Every morning began with a ritual called the lever. At dawn, nobles gathered in his bedroom to watch him rise. Imagine rubbing sleep from your eyes while 50 courtiers stand at attention, eager to hand you a sleeve or a sock. The king's body wasn't private, it was a stage. Servants announced each step. His Majesty will now put on his stockings. And courtiers competed for the honor of helping. One might hold his shirt. Another, if especially lucky, might hand him his wig. The whole thing could last hours. By the time Louis was fully dressed, the day's politics were already underway. Favors traded. Alliances whispered. And the king, freshly powdered and perfumed, had barely left his bedroom. Over in Spain, routines had a more religious flavor. Take Philip II, a deeply devout king. His mornings began not with courtiers but with Massachusetts. He kept his palace, the Escorial, designed almost like a monastery. Meals were plain. Sleep was brief. Philip's routine wasn't about glitter or glory, it was about duty, discipline, and prayer. But it had its quirks. Philip was obsessive about paperwork. He spent hours each day hunched over letters, notes, and decrees, scribbling in the margins with cramped handwriting. His servants complained that he often worked into the night, candle stubs burning down to pools of wax, his eyes watering from strain. The most powerful man in the world, behaving like an anxious office clerk. Across the channel, in England, routines grew even stranger. Elizabeth I was famously meticulous. She owned over 2,000 gowns, each carefully maintained. Dressing her was a morning ordeal, with servants layering silks, lace, and jewels. She was also fastidious about her teeth, though by her later years, they had rotted badly from sugar. Ambassadors often noted the smell of her breath during meetings. But Elizabeth's most unusual habit was her baths. She bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. And she made a ritual of it, surrounding herself with scented oils and musicians to soften the experience. For her, bathing was a kind of performance. One that left the entire court whispering about her legendary purity, though in truth, she wasn't all that clean. In Russia, court life could be both brutal and bizarre. Take Peter the Great. He rose early, often before sunrise, and demanded others do the same. His routine included long hours of study, shipbuilding, anatomy, even dentistry. He was obsessed with practical knowledge. So obsessed that he sometimes performed surgery himself, pulling teeth from terrified courtiers just to practice. Imagine being summoned to the Tsar's chamber at dawn, and leaving with one fewer molar. For Peter, this wasn't cruelty, it was curiosity. But it meant that mornings with him were as unpredictable as storms. Would you be discussing naval design? Or would you be lying back in a chair while the Tsar pried at your jaw with pliers? Only the day would tell. Further back in medieval England, kings lived with simpler, almost rustic routines. Take Henry II. He was notorious for his restless energy. He woke at dawn, leapt from bed, and often spent his mornings pacing. He rarely sat down, even during meals, preferring to eat standing while barking orders. His chamber was cluttered with letters, maps, and half-finished food. He was a king in constant motion, impatient, untidy, and always half-dressed. Servants muttered that he seemed more like a soldier than a monarch. But perhaps that was the secret to his authority. His routine was chaos, but it kept him sharp. And then there are the rituals of going to bed. In France, again, Louis XIV had his coucher, the evening counterpart to his morning ritual. Nobles gathered to watch the king undress and climb into bed. Candles glowed, trumpets sounded, and courtiers jostled for the honor of holding his nightshirt. To be part of the king's bedtime was to be close to his power. In Russia, by contrast, Peter the Great's nights often ended in drunken feasts. He drank heavily, sang loudly, and forced others to keep pace. What began as a royal dinner could end with courtiers sprawled unconscious on palace floors. The Tsar's bedtime routine was less ceremony, more chaos. In England, Queen Victoria had a different habit. She kept detailed journals, writing every night before sleep. Even after long days of ceremony, she insisted on recording her thoughts. Thousands of pages survive, giving us not just history but the voice of a woman who needed routine to anchor her. For Victoria, bedtime was reflection. What all these routines reveal is that monarchs, for all their crowns and titles, were creatures of habit. Some sought prayer. Others demanded spectacle. Some rose early in bursts of energy. Others lingered for hours in ceremony. But all of them turned the simple acts of waking and sleeping into rituals of power. And perhaps that's the strangest thing. What for us is private, the first yawn of morning, the last sigh of night, for kings and queens became public theater. Their bodies weren't just their own. They were symbols. Stages. Sometimes prisons. So tonight, as we drift into our own quiet routines, pillows adjusted, blankets tucked, we might feel a little grateful. No courtiers watching us brush our teeth. No trumpets announcing our pajamas. No emperors waiting to practice dentistry at dawn. Just the gentle, private rhythm of an ordinary life. Imagine the long tables of a medieval great hall. Flickering torches on the walls, the smell of roasted meat in the air, and nobles perched on benches, waiting for the first dish to arrive. At the far end, on a raised dais, sits the king or queen. Their plates gleam with silver. Their goblets brim with wine. But what actually landed on those royal plates? In medieval England, kings were fond of heavy, meat-laden diets. Henry VIII, for instance, could eat his way through astonishing amounts of beef, venison, swan, and even peacock. A single banquet might feature dozens of roasted birds, elaborately presented with feathers reattached to their cooked bodies. Because naturally, it wasn't enough to eat the bird. One had to prove it had once been magnificent. Henry's kitchens at Hampton Court were vast, the largest in Europe. Dozens of cooks worked in sweltering heat, turning spits of roasting meat day and night. Servants hauled barrels of beer and trays of pies, while bakers rolled out endless loaves of bread. It was a factory of indulgence, and Henry, with his growing girth and aching legs, was both the proud owner and its most loyal customer. In France, the meals of Louis XIV took a different form. The Sun King dined in public. Every evening, he sat down to supper in his chamber at Versailles, with courtiers crowding the room to watch. Eating, for Louis, was performance. He consumed enormous amounts: soups, game birds, mutton, fish, pastries, fruit, and, his weakness, sweet treats like candied fruit and chocolate. Doctors warned him about overeating, but Louis ignored them. By his later years, he suffered from gout, ulcers, and general misery, yet he continued to indulge. The spectacle of his meals mattered more than his health. After all, what kind of Sun King nibbles on lettuce? Meanwhile, in Spain, royal food leaned more austere. Philip II preferred simple meals, stews, bread, fruit. His piety extended even to his diet. Visitors often remarked how plain his table seemed compared to other monarchs. While his nobles might crave exotic flavors, Philip seemed content with the culinary equivalent of a monk's lunch. But this didn't stop the Spanish court from indulging in lavish imports. chocolate, brought from the New World, became a favorite among the Spanish elite. Thick, spiced, and served hot, it was less a drink and more a meal in itself. Court ladies sipped it slowly from porcelain cups, convinced it was both delicious and medicinal. Philip tolerated this trend, though he himself remained loyal to bread and olives. Russian Tsars, on the other hand, embraced excess with gusto. Peter the Great enjoyed enormous feasts, often accompanied by rivers of vodka. Meals were less about refinement and more about abundance. Whole animals roasted, endless fish dishes, mountains of bread. His court was notorious for turning dinner into an all-night affair, where eating and drinking blurred into singing, brawling, and collapsing under the table. Peter's tastes weren't exactly delicate. He was known to gnaw on black bread and onions, preferring the hearty fare of peasants over dainty delicacies. But when it came to entertaining others, he made sure the spread was impossible to finish. Back in England, the Georgian kings brought their own peculiarities. George III, remembered now for his bouts of madness, had surprisingly modest tastes. He preferred plain dishes, roast mutton, simple puddings, boiled eggs. Courtiers joked that his table resembled that of a country squire more than a king. And yet, he relished it. To him, plain food was honest. His son, George IV, was the opposite. He was a gourmand, famous for overindulgence. At his banquets, dishes piled up in decadent succession, French pastries, jellies, creams, and enormous roasts. He grew enormously fat, his body weighed down by years of gluttony. Where his father had been mocked for dullness, George IV was mocked for excess. Of course, royal meals weren't just about the food. They were about ritual. In England, meal times began with elaborate ceremonies. Dishes were paraded in by servants, sometimes preceded by musicians. Taste testers sampled each item to guard against poison. Dishes were carved at the table, with special servants trained in the precise art of slicing meat into elegant portions. Even salt was treated with reverence, stored in elaborate containers called salt cellars, placed directly in front of the monarch. To sit above the salt was a mark of status. To sit below, well, you knew your place. Some monarchs had peculiar habits tied to their food. Queen Elizabeth I, for example, was fond of sweets. She consumed sugar candies, syrups, and spiced cakes daily. Over time, her teeth blackened and decayed, a visible reminder of her indulgence. Yet at court, this became a fashionable look. Nobles, eager to imitate her, blackened their own teeth with soot, pretending to have the same expensive problem. Charles II of England had another quirk: he adored oranges. He was so fond of them that an entire trade developed around supplying his court. Servants scurried to peel and slice them for him during meals, while poets even wrote verses praising his citrus obsession. And then there is the matter of waste. Royal banquets often produced mountains of leftovers. But these were not simply discarded. Instead, they were distributed among servants, guards, and even the poor. Receiving scraps from a king's table was considered an honor. Imagine being handed half a goose, or a chunk of pie, and telling your neighbors, yes, the king chewed near this. In some courts, leftovers became part of official salaries. Servants were expected to resell food they couldn't eat, turning royal waste into profit. It was both practical and faintly absurd. When we step back, royal food tells us much about royal lives. Henry VIII's endless meat mirrored his appetite for power and display. Louis XIV's sugary indulgence reflected the glittering spectacle of Versailles. Philip II's bread and olives showed his monkish devotion. Peter the Great's vodka-soaked feasts embodied his chaotic, unpredictable energy. And yet, for all their differences, monarchs shared one truth: food was never just food. It was identity. It was politics. It was performance. So as we drift deeper into the night, it's comforting to know that even the grandest kings and queens weren't necessarily well-fed in the way we'd like. Their meals were extravagant, excessive, sometimes strange, and often unhealthy. They suffered from gout, tooth decay, indigestion, and all the quiet miseries of gluttony. Tonight, perhaps a simple snack before bed is enough. Something plain, unceremonious. A cup of tea. A biscuit. No courtiers required. And with that, The banquet ends, and the candles dim once more. Let's imagine walking through a royal palace at night. The torches are dimmed, the servants have withdrawn, and the great halls echo with silence. Behind thick doors and heavy curtains, kings and queens settle into their beds. And yet, even in these private spaces, sleep was rarely simple. In medieval Europe, royal beds themselves were symbols. Take the grand four-poster beds of English kings. Tall, carved with intricate designs, draped with heavy curtains. These weren't just furniture. They were stages of power. A king might receive visitors while reclining in bed, conducting business while propped on pillows. To be admitted to the royal bedchamber, even during the day, was a rare mark of intimacy and influence. At night, those same curtains served a more practical purpose: warmth, privacy, and perhaps the illusion of safety. Because kings and queens often feared the night. Behind the luxury was an anxiety that someone might creep in with a dagger. The bed was both a throne of rest and a fortress of fabric. Consider Louis XIV again. The Sun King's bed at Versailles was not just a place to sleep. It was the center of ceremony. His couch, a ritual, when courtiers gathered to watch him go to bed, turned sleep into public theater. Nobles jostled for the honor of handing him his nightshirt, or tucking in the covers. Even unconsciousness was political. And in the morning, he reversed it with the lever. It's almost comical, half his day bookended by pajamas. But it shows just how little privacy royalty could claim. Other monarchs, however, clung to more personal habits. Mary, Queen of Scots, during her years of captivity, slept poorly. She complained of restless nights, of cold stone walls, of suspicious noises in the dark. Servants recorded her requests for extra blankets and softer bedding. For a queen once surrounded by splendor, these small discomforts became daily miseries. Her bed was no longer a stage of power, but a reminder of lost freedom. Then there were the superstitions that haunted royal bedrooms. In the Middle Ages, people feared that sleep left the body vulnerable. Evil spirits might creep in. Nightmares were sometimes blamed on demons, the so-called incubus or succubus, pressing down on the chest. Monarchs, for all their power, weren't immune to these fears. Beds were often blessed with holy water. Charms might be hung nearby, sprigs of herbs, crosses, relics. In some courts, priests were tasked with praying for the monarch's safe rest, as though their dreams might affect the stability of the entire kingdom. And sometimes, they believed they did. Dreams were treated as omens. If a king dreamed of water, it might mean war. If a queen dreamed of fire, it might mean betrayal. Interpreters at court took these nocturnal wanderings seriously, sometimes shaping political decisions around them. Imagine a kingdom's fate hinging on whether a monarch had cheese before bed. In Russia, the nights could be harsher. Palaces were drafty, winters bitter. Tsars slept under heavy furs, often in chambers lined with icons. They clung to religious rituals before sleep, crossing themselves repeatedly, whispering prayers, hoping to ward off both assassins and nightmares. Some tsars even slept in shifts, waking servants through the night to ensure no one crept close. Sleep, for them, was never fully peaceful. Peter the Great, restless by nature, often slept irregularly. He worked into the night, then collapsed for brief naps. His bed was less sanctuary, more pit stop. Servants noted that he sometimes dozed on tables, his head resting on piles of maps. For a man who tried to control everything, even his own sleep seemed haphazard. Back in England, royal bedrooms became oddly public spaces. Queen Elizabeth I, though fiercely protective of her privacy, still slept surrounded by attendants. Even at night, she was rarely alone. Ladies-in-waiting hovered nearby, ready to fetch water or comfort her in the dark. For Elizabeth, sleep was an act observed, managed, and occasionally interrupted. She could never truly let her guard down. Centuries later, Queen Victoria offered a contrast. After the death of Prince Albert, she famously slept beside his clothes laid out on a chair, as though he were still present. For decades, this became part of her nightly ritual. The bed, once a shared space, became a shrine of grief. Her chambers filled with mourning, even as the rest of the palace moved on. And then there is the question of where monarchs chose to sleep. Some kings preferred large, ceremonial rooms. Others hid themselves away. Henry VIII, for example, often changed his bedchamber, sometimes without warning. Paranoia drove him to shift from room to room, trying to prevent assassins from knowing where he'd be. His bed was a moving target, a portable throne of vulnerability. By contrast, Louis XIV never wavered. He slept in the same bed at Versailles, night after night, as though daring the world to find him there. Perhaps confidence, perhaps stubbornness. When we look closely, royal sleep tells us more than their meals or their wars. It shows us their fears, their rituals, their longing for safety and comfort. A royal bed was rarely just a bed. It was a stage, a shrine, a shield. Curtains weren't just fabric, they were barriers between fragile human flesh and the endless dangers of the night. And so, as we let our own rooms darken, perhaps we feel a small relief. No attendants hovering with holy water. No nobles fighting to tuck in our sheets. No kingdom's fate hanging on whether we dream of fire or water. Just a quiet bed. A private night. A sleep untouched by ceremony. Let's begin with the obvious. Royal children were not raised like ordinary children. Their births were public events. Their cradles were political symbols. And from the moment they could walk, their lives were carefully managed, stage by stage, by tutors, nurses, and advisors. The result? Many of them grew into rulers who had very little idea what ordinary life looked like. Take Louis XIII of France, the boy king. He became king at the age of 8, after the death of his father, Henry IV. At that age, most children are still learning multiplication. Louis was learning how to carry the weight of a crown. His childhood was filled with endless ceremonies, regents making decisions in his name, and constant reminders that he was not simply a boy, but the body of France itself. The pressure turned him into a quiet, withdrawn child. He stammered when speaking. He struggled to connect with others. And yet, he had to sit through hours of stiff rituals each day. By the time he grew into adulthood, he was timid, awkward, and deeply dependent on advisors. A childhood lived in velvet had left him brittle. Over in Spain, we find perhaps the most famous example of royal childhood fragility, the Habsburgs. Generations of inbreeding had left their children frail from the start. None more so than Charles II of Spain, nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Born in 1661, Charles was sickly from infancy. His head was disproportionately large, his jaw so misshapen that he could barely chew, his body so weak that he did not learn to walk until the age of 4. Nurses hovered over him constantly, fearing he might not survive the night. Doctors prescribed endless remedies, purges, charms, prayers. Superstition mixed with medicine, but little helped. Charles survived to adulthood, but he remained fragile, infertile, and plagued by illness. His sad childhood set the tone for his tragic reign. He was less a ruler than a living reminder of dynastic collapse. In England, childhood was often a lonely ordeal. Consider Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII. Born in 1537, he was the much-anticipated male heir. From birth, he was surrounded by nurses and physicians, and treated as the savior of the dynasty. His father adored him, but in the manner of a collector admiring a rare coin. Edward's tutors pressed him with hours of study each day, Latin, theology, politics. He was praised for his intelligence, but his body was frail. He caught illnesses easily, coughed through lessons, and grew thinner each year. His childhood was so carefully guarded that he barely knew other children. And when he became king at the age of 9, he was too weak to rule for long. He died at 15, having never known a life beyond books and doctors. On the other end of the spectrum were royal children who were spoiled into disaster. Take Louis XV of France. After the death of his parents, he was raised by doting caretakers who treated him with indulgence. He grew into a man who adored comfort, avoided hard decisions, and surrounded himself with mistresses. His childhood, soft and overprotected, seemed to drain him of resolve. By adulthood, he was more interested in distraction than governance. His reign left France politically unstable, paving the way for revolution. And then there were those children raised in almost theatrical isolation. Maria Theresa of Austria, though later remembered as a formidable empress, grew up in a strange environment. Her education was highly practical. She was trained to sew, to sing, and to manage a household. Because, naturally, no one believed she would inherit power. Girls, after all, were not expected to rule. And so her childhood was filled with lessons in charm rather than statecraft. When she did inherit, she found herself unprepared, scrambling to manage armies and diplomacy. Her childhood had left her graceful, but untrained. And she had to learn fast, with the fate of her empire at stake. Royal childhood also meant being constantly watched. Children of kings were rarely alone. Nurses reported every sneeze, every tantrum, every stumble. If a royal toddler cried too long, it was whispered about in court. If a prince seemed too quiet, rumors of sickness spread. Childhood became theater, performed for anxious nobles. Imagine being 5 years old, and every time you tripped in the garden, ambassadors wrote letters about it. That was life for royal heirs. Of course, some childhoods were darker still. Ivan the Terrible, for instance, grew up amid chaos in Moscow. His father died when Ivan was only 3. His mother followed shortly after, likely poisoned. Left to the care of noble families, Ivan's childhood was marked by neglect, cruelty, and humiliation. Servants often ignored him, sometimes beating him, sometimes letting him wander in rags. This neglect hardened him. By the time he reached adolescence, Ivan had developed a vicious streak. He took revenge on animals, then on people. His childhood misery grew into adult brutality. In his case, the spoiled and the sickly were replaced by something worse, the scarred and the vengeful. But perhaps the saddest truth is this: many royal children did not survive at all. High infant mortality rates meant that even in palaces, death hovered close. Queens gave birth repeatedly, often losing half their children before they reached adulthood. For every surviving king or queen, there were brothers and sisters buried quietly in chapels. And so the survivors carried not only crowns, but the ghosts of siblings who never lived long enough to wear them. Childhood was not only lonely, it was haunted. When we look at these royal nurseries, we see a pattern. Some children were spoiled into uselessness. Others were educated into brutal fragility. Some were neglected into cruelty. And many never grew up at all. The crown promised them splendor, but rarely happiness. So tonight, as we lie in our ordinary beds, there's something quietly comforting in the thought. Childhood, for us, was allowed to be messy, playful, even imperfect. For royal children, every sneeze and stumble was destiny. And in many cases, those destinies were not enviable at all.